My parents called security when I showed up to Dad's retirement party. The security guard. My name is Renata Hart, though everyone except my mother calls me Rennie, and I want to tell you about the night two security guards in matching navy polos walked me out of the Fairview Country Club while 200 people watched, because my father had told them I wasn't on the guest list. I was 42 years old. I had spent the last 11 years as the financial controller for a mid-sized logistics company in Ohio, the kind of job where people trust you with numbers because you have never once let a number lie to you. I had a manila folder under my arm that night, thick with bank statements and notarized documents, an address I'd bought 2 weeks earlier because my father was retiring after 40 years at Ridgeline Manufacturing, and I wanted to look nice for the photographs. There were no photographs of me at that party. There's a video, though. Someone's cousin filmed it on a phone, and for about 4 months it made its way around a Facebook group for people from our town, with a caption that said something like, "When the black sheep tries to ruin Dad's big night." I've watched it exactly once. In it, I don't yell. I don't cry. I hand a folder to a man in a rented tuxedo, and I say something I'd practiced in my car for 20 minutes, and then I walk out on my own 2 feet before the guards even reach me, because I wanted it clear, for anyone watching, that I left because I chose to. That's the end of the story, though. To understand how I got there, how a woman who spent her whole life trying not to make waves ended up being escorted out of her father's retirement party by rented security, you have to go back much further than that folder. You have to go back to a 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Avenue, and to a boy 2 years younger than me who broke things and never once got blamed for it. Before I take you there, if you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories about families, the quiet kind of betrayal that doesn't look like betrayal until you're standing in the middle of it, and the slow, patient work of building a life on the other side of it. If any of this sounds familiar to you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you want to come back for the next one, there's a subscribe button right there waiting for you. Now, let me take you back to where it started. Larkspur Avenue. My father, Frank Kowalski, started at Ridgeline Manufacturing the same year I was born, running a stamping press on the line before he worked his way up to floor supervisor, and then to plant supervisor, a job he held for 26 years until the night I'm telling you about. My mother, Carol, stayed home while my brother Brian and I were small, and then went back to part-time work at the church office once Brian started kindergarten, mostly because she liked being needed somewhere with a title, even a small one. Parish secretary had a nice ring to it, she used to say. I was born first, in 1984. Brian came 2 years later, in 1986, and from what I can piece together from old photo albums and the stories my grandmother used to tell before her memory started slipping, something shifted in our house the year he was born that never fully shifted back. He was a difficult baby, colicky, my mother said, though I think now some of that was just Brian being Brian before he had the vocabulary to explain himself. And my parents' attention organized itself around him the way a tide organizes itself around whatever's heaviest in the water. I don't say that with bitterness. Not anymore. I say it because it's true, and because if I don't tell you honestly what our house was like, none of what happened later will make sense. Our house on Larkspur Avenue was a modest split level with green aluminum siding, 2 blocks from Immaculate Heart, where we went to Mass every Sunday and where my mother worked. My father left before 6 every morning and came home a little after 4, smelling like machine oil and coffee, and he ate dinner in near silence most nights, not because he was unhappy, but because he'd spent all day directing 40 men and didn't have much left over for conversation. My mother filled the silence. She always had something to report, who'd said what at the parish council meeting, whose daughter was pregnant again, whose son had gotten into trouble. Brian got into trouble a lot, even as a kid. He broke my bike once, riding it down the Fenton's driveway even though I'd told him not to, and when I cried about it, my mother told me I shouldn't have left it where he could reach it. He failed 2 grades of math and my parents hired a tutor. He wrecked the car my father had saved for 2 years to buy him, the summer he turned 8, and by Christmas that year there was a new used truck in the driveway with his name on the title, paid for, my mother said, so he'd have reliable transportation for work, though the work in question lasted about 4 months. I want to be fair to him. Brian was, and is, genuinely charming, the kind of person who remembers your kid's name and asks about your knee surgery and makes you feel, for the 15 minutes you're talking to him, like you're the most important person in the room. He was funny at family dinners. He could make my father laugh, which almost nobody else could do. Still has, a kind of gravity that pulls people toward forgiving him before they've even fully articulated what they're forgiving him for. I was the other kind of kid. Quiet. Good grades. I did my homework at the kitchen table without being asked twice. I babysat the neighbors' kids for spending money instead of asking my parents for it. And I got a full scholarship to Ohio State for accounting, which nobody in my family had done before, gone somewhere on a scholarship, I mean. My mother mentioned it to people sometimes, at church, with a kind of surprised pride, the way you'd mention a plant that grew taller than you expected without much watering. That was the shape of things. Brian was the project, I was the given. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from when I was maybe 11 and Brian was 9. It was a Saturday, and my father had taken the two of us to the hardware store, which he did most Saturdays, mostly because my mother wanted the house to herself for a few hours. Brian knocked over a display of paint cans, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way he did most things, and 3 of them split open on the concrete floor. The store manager came over, understandably annoyed, and my father apologized, paid for the damage, and then in the truck on the way home, he didn't say a single word to Brian about it. He turned to me instead and said, "You need to watch him better when we're out. You're the oldest." I was 11. Brian was standing right there. He didn't get in trouble. I did, for not preventing trouble that wasn't mine to prevent. I didn't understand it then as a pattern. I understood it as one Saturday, one paint can, one sentence in a truck. It would take me another 3 decades to see the whole shape of it, stretching front to back through my entire childhood like a load-bearing wall nobody had ever pointed out to me. Holding up a house I'd been living in my whole life without knowing which parts of it I wasn't allowed to touch. What we were each allowed to want. By the time I was in high school, the roles in our family had hardened into something like furniture, heavy, permanent, the kind of thing nobody discusses because it's simply always been there. I was the responsible one. Brian was the one who needed help. And somewhere underneath that, unspoken but understood by everyone in the house, was the idea that responsible people didn't need help, so they shouldn't expect any, and people who needed help got it in whatever amount was necessary, without much accounting. I got a job at the pharmacy on 6th Street the summer I turned 16, mostly because I wanted my own money and partly because I understood, without ever being told directly, that asking my parents for things put a strain on them that Brian's asking didn't. When my class ring came up for order, I paid for it myself. When my prom dress needed altering, I did it with a sewing kit I bought at Walmart rather than ask my mother to take it to the tailor, because I'd overheard her on the phone with my Aunt Pat, complaining about how tight money was that month. The same month Brian got a new pair of hockey skates. I'm not telling you this to make my parents sound like monsters. They weren't. My father worked brutally hard and believed, in his bones, that hard work should be rewarded eventually, and he genuinely thought he was being fair. He would have told you, if you'd asked him at the time, that he loved his children equally. My mother believed that a mother's job was to make sure nobody in her house went without, and Brian, in her eyes, was always on the edge of going without, in a way I never seemed to be. I think now that she read my self-sufficiency as a kind of proof that I didn't need watching, and she read Brian's chaos as a kind of proof that he did, and neither of them ever stopped to ask whether the self-sufficiency had a cost, or whether the chaos was being rewarded into permanence. There's a moment from my senior year that I think about often. I'd gotten my acceptance letter from Ohio State, with the scholarship attached, and I remember standing in the kitchen holding it, genuinely thrilled, waiting for my parents to look up from what they were doing. My father was at the table doing the household bills, the way he did every first of the month, brow furrowed over a checkbook and a stack of envelopes. My mother was on the phone with Aunt Pat. I said I got in, full ride basically, just fees and books. My father looked up and said, "That's great, Ren," and meant it. I think there was real warmth in his face for a second. But then his eyes went back down to the checkbook, and he said, half to himself, "That'll help." I don't know how we're going to cover Brian's testing fees for the trade program if the truck needs new brakes too. I didn't say anything. I went up to my room and sat on my bed for a long time, not crying exactly, just sitting with a feeling I didn't have a name for yet, something like relief and grief happening in the same breath. Relief that I'd built myself an exit that didn't depend on anyone's checkbook. Grief that the exit had felt, even for a second, more important to my father than the thing that had built it. I left for Columbus that August with 2 suitcases and $140 I'd saved from the pharmacy job, and something in me settled, in that first semester, that I hadn't expected. A kind of quiet the whole system had never let me have at home. Nobody needed watching. Nobody's chaos organized my days. I studied accounting because I liked the way it made a mess resolve into a clean, provable answer. And I think if I'm honest with myself, some of that had roots in a house where nothing ever got fully resolved, where blame and credit moved around according to rules nobody had ever written down. And I wanted, more than almost anything, to live somewhere with a ledger that balanced. Building my own ledger. College is where I met Daniel. He was a year ahead of me, studying to be a high school history teacher, and the first thing I noticed about him, the thing that made me trust him before I even knew I was deciding to, was that he asked me questions and then actually waited for the answers. Nobody in my family did that. Conversations at home were mostly people delivering reports to each other, waiting for their turn to talk again. Daniel would ask what I thought about something and then go quiet, like my answer genuinely mattered to how the conversation would go next. We married in 2009, the summer after I finished my CPA licensing, in a small ceremony at Daniel's parents' church, because it was cheaper than the venue my mother wanted. And because by then I'd learned that the version of a wedding my mother imagined tended to come with an invoice that landed, one way or another, in my lap. My parents came. Brian was best man, even though Daniel barely knew him, because my mother had cried at the idea of Brian not standing up at his sister's wedding, and I'd given in the way I usually gave in, because giving in cost less than the fight. Our daughter Maya was born in 2010, and our son Theo in 2014. I took my accounting career seriously through both pregnancies and after. I made senior analyst at 30, and by 35 I was controller at Halstead Freight Solutions, overseeing an 8-person department and a company with revenue in the tens of millions. I liked my job in a way that surprised people when I described it. There's a satisfaction in a spreadsheet that finally reconciles, in a discrepancy you chase down to its root cause, in being the person a company trusts to say, with total confidence, this is exactly where the money went. Meanwhile, Brian's 20s and early 30s moved in a different rhythm. He tried the trade program my father had scraped together the fees for and dropped out after a year. He worked a string of jobs, sales, mostly, a stint managing a gym, a longer stint doing something with home renovation that never seemed to produce actual renovated homes, and married Denise in 2015, a marketing coordinator with a sharp eye for how things looked and a smaller interest in how things actually were. They had no children, which Denise would tell you, at any gathering, was a deliberate choice tied to her career, though I noticed over the years that the story shifted depending on who was asking. Every few years, Brian had an idea that was going to be the one that finally worked: a food truck, a line of protein supplements, a property-flipping partnership with a guy he'd met at the gym. And every few years, my parents found a way to help fund the idea's beginning, and nobody ever seemed to track what happened to the idea's end. I noticed this. I want to be honest and tell you I noticed it for years before I ever said anything, and that the reason I didn't say anything wasn't kindness. It was self-protection. Every time I'd raised anything about fairness in our family, going back to childhood, I'd been told, gently but firmly, that I didn't understand how hard things were for Brian, that I'd always had things easier, that I should be grateful for what I had instead of counting what he had. So I stopped counting out loud. I kept a private ledger instead, the way you'd keep a wound you didn't want examined, and I told myself it didn't matter, because my life was good, and Daniel was good, and my kids were healthy, and none of that depended on my parents' math being fair. I believed that mostly for almost 15 years. It's a strange thing, looking back, to realize how long a person can hold two true things in her hands at once: that her life is genuinely good, and that a quiet, specific unfairness has been running underneath it the entire time, waiting for a reason to surface. The reason arrived, eventually, in the shape of my father's retirement, and a spreadsheet I was never supposed to see. The power of attorney. In March of 2019, my father had what the doctors called a minor cardiac event. Not a heart attack exactly, but close enough to one that everyone in the family spent 3 days in a waiting room at St. Vincent's, drinking bad coffee and speaking to each other in the careful, overpolite way families speak when they're afraid. He was 61. He recovered fully, was back at Ridgeline within 6 weeks, and the whole thing might have faded into a story we told at holidays, remember, when Dad scared us half to death. Except for one detail that stuck in my chest like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. While he was still in the hospital, before he was even fully lucid from the sedation, my mother had Brian bring over a stack of legal forms for my father to sign, a durable power of attorney, naming Brian as the person authorized to make financial decisions on my father's behalf if he ever became incapacitated. I found out about it 3 days later, when my mother mentioned it in passing while we were folding laundry at their house, the way you'd mention you'd switched brands of coffee. "Your father signed the POA paperwork," she said. "Brian's going to handle things if anything ever happens again." I remember setting down the towel I was folding. "Why Brian?" I asked, as gently as I could manage. "I'm the one with the accounting background, Mom. It might make more sense for me to." "It's not about qualifications, Rennie," she said, in the tone she used when a conversation was already over as far as she was concerned. "Brian's closer. He's only 20 minutes away. You're 40 minutes with the kids' schedules, and you've got your career. We didn't want to be a burden on you." It sounded reasonable, said that way. It's still, to this day, one of the most effective sentences my mother has ever used against me, the framing of exclusion as consideration, as if being left out of my own father's care was a gift she was giving me instead of a door quietly closing. I let it go. I told myself she was right, that I was busy, that Brian living closer was a legitimate logistical point. I didn't examine, at the time, why a man who had never once balanced his own checkbook without help was now the legal authority over my father's entire financial life. I want to tell you that I pushed harder, that some early version of the woman who eventually stood in a country club ballroom with a folder of evidence spoke up in that kitchen and said what needed to be said. She didn't. I finished folding the towel. I asked if Dad wanted his lunch reheated. I went back to being the daughter who didn't make things harder than they already were. The home equity line. In September of 2020, in the strange, muffled middle of the pandemic, my parents took out a home equity line of credit against the house on Larkspur Avenue. A house they'd owned outright for 11 years, ever since they'd paid off the original mortgage in 2009. I learned about it almost by accident, the way I learned about most things in that family. My mother mentioned, during a phone call about something else entirely, that Brian's new venture, a specialty pressure washing franchise, this time, had needed a little bridge money to get the equipment, and that my father had worked something out with the bank. The number she mentioned, offhand, was $62,000. I did the math without meaning to, the way I do math on almost everything, a professional reflex I couldn't have turned off if I'd tried. $62,000 against a paid-off house, at the interest rates being offered that year, meant a new monthly payment my parents hadn't had in over a decade, carved out of a fixed income that consisted of my father's plant supervisor salary, and within 2 years, his pension. I asked my mother, carefully, whether Brian was going to be paying that loan back directly, or whether the plan was for my parents to carry the payment themselves. "He'll pay us back once the business gets going," she said. "You know how it is when you're starting something. Cash flows tight at first." I did know how it was when you were starting something, actually. Daniel and I had started a small tutoring side business the year before, out of our own savings, no loans, because I'd never once in my adult life considered it an option to ask my parents to bridge anything for me. I said none of that out loud. What I said was, "Just make sure you have something in writing, Mom, even between family. It protects everybody." She laughed, not unkindly, the specific laugh she reserved for whenever I said something she considered overly formal for family matters. "It's not a business deal, Rennie. It's your brother." I let that sit in my chest for a long time after we hung up. It's your brother. As if being someone's family member automatically excused the absence of the exact same protections any bank, any lender, any responsible party would insist on with a stranger. I thought about the 11 years my parents had spent paying down that mortgage, the vacations they hadn't taken, the used cars they'd driven instead of new ones, all of it to arrive at the milestone of owning their home free and clear, and how quickly that milestone had been mortgaged again, without paperwork, without a repayment schedule, on the strength of a phrase that functioned less like an agreement and more like a spell. It's your brother. The pressure washing franchise lasted 14 months. I know because I looked up the business registration years later, after everything came apart, and saw the dissolution filing dated December of 2021. I never heard about the loan being paid back. I never asked. I told myself again that it wasn't my business, and I went back to my own life, which was, that year, full and busy, and I told myself, entirely separate from whatever was happening on Larkspur Avenue. Thanksgiving, 2021. Thanksgiving that year was at my parents' house. The same as always, the table extended with the same folding leaf my father pulled out of the hall closet every November. The same tablecloth with the faint gravy stain near the head that never quite came out in the wash, no matter how many times my mother tried. 14 of us crowded around it, Daniel and me and our kids, Brian and Denise, my parents, my grandmother Sophie, who was 85 that year and still sharp, and my Aunt Pat and Uncle Walt, along with Pat's 2 grown kids and their families. Brian showed up in a new truck. I noticed it before I even got out of my car, a dark gray F-250, the kind with a sticker price that would have made my accountant's brain wince even if I hadn't already known, from a conversation with my mother 3 weeks earlier, that his previous truck had been repossessed after he'd fallen behind on payments during the pressure washing collapse. Nobody at the table mentioned the truck. I watched my father's face when Brian pulled into the driveway, and I saw something there I recognized, a flicker of concern, quickly smoothed over. The same look he used to get when Brian brought home a report card that should have worried him more than it seemed to. Dinner went the way our family dinners went. My mother directing traffic between the kitchen and the table, my father carving the turkey with the same deliberate concentration he brought to everything mechanical. Aunt Pat delivering a running commentary on everyone's lives that walked right up to the edge of gossip and stepped over it twice before dessert. At one point, apropos of nothing, my grandmother turned to Brian and asked, in the direct way people her age sometimes get to speak, "Whose truck is that in the driveway, honey? Did you sell the old one?" Brian laughed it off. "New opportunity came up, Grandma. Gotta look the part." He said it the way he said most things about money, breezy, confident, a little performance built for an audience that mostly wanted to believe him. My grandmother looked at him for a second longer than the joke warranted, and then looked, briefly, at me. I've thought about that look more times than I can count since. I think she saw something the rest of the table had trained itself not to see. She died 8 months later, before any of what I'm about to tell you came to light, and I've often wished I could have sat with her one more time and asked what she knew, or suspected, in that dining room, with the gravy-stained tablecloth and the turkey going cold, while everyone politely changed the subject. After dinner, in the kitchen, while I was helping my mother with dishes, she brought up again, in the passing, offhand way she delivered most financial news, that she and my father had co-signed on the truck loan. "Just to help him get the rate down," she said. "His credit took a hit after the franchise thing." I dried a serving dish and didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked, "Does that show up as a liability on your credit, Mom? If he misses a payment, does it hit your score too?" "I don't know, honestly," she said. "Your father handled the paperwork." I thought about asking to see the paperwork. I thought about it seriously, standing at that sink, my hands full of someone else's turkey grease. And then Theo came running into the kitchen wanting help with a jigsaw puzzle, and the moment passed the way these moments always passed in our family, not resolved, just absorbed, folded into the general noise of a holiday, waiting. Willow Creek. Before the down payment, before the group chat, Before any of the discoveries that would eventually fill my folder, there was Willow Creek Nursing Home, where my grandmother spent the last 4 months of her life. And a detail from that period that I didn't fully understand until much later, when I finally had the whole spreadsheet in front of me and could see how it connected to everything else. Willow Creek cost just over $7,000 a month, most of it covered by my grandmother's own savings and a small long-term care policy my grandfather had, with unusual foresight, purchased decades earlier. But there was a gap. Long-term care policies rarely cover everything. And in March of 2022, about 6 weeks into her stay, the facility sent a letter noting an outstanding balance of $4,800 that needed to be resolved before the next billing cycle. I know about this only because my mother mentioned it to me at the time, worried, asking whether I thought they should dip into their own savings to cover it while the estate paperwork worked itself out. I told her that seemed reasonable, a short-term bridge, easily repaid once Grandma's accounts were settled. What I didn't know until much later, cross-referencing dates in the spreadsheet almost a year afterward, was that the $4,800 my parents fronted for my grandmother's care was paid back to them, in full within 3 weeks. Directly from my grandmother's account once the paperwork cleared, and that in the very same week that repayment arrived, an entry appeared in my mother's spreadsheet. March 2022, $4,800, Brian, helping while grandma stuff gets sorted. Told him this comes out of what he already owes. The money that had briefly, legitimately, bridged my grandmother's care had been repaid promptly and appropriately by her estate, exactly as it should have been. And then, the very same week, an equivalent sum had moved straight through my parents' account and out to Brian, under the loose cover of the same general, family stuff going on that had justified the original bridge loan. I don't think my mother saw the two transactions as connected in any meaningful way when she made them. I think, if you'd asked her at the time, she'd have described them as two separate, ordinary instances of a mother helping the people who needed her. But looking at them side by side, a year later, in the flat, unforgiving language of dates and dollar amounts, I saw something else. A pattern so practiced it had become nearly invisible even to the person practicing it. A reflex of redirection so old and so well-worn that money could pass through my parents' hands on its way to my grandmother's care, and somehow, within the same week, leave a matching-sized hole headed the opposite direction, toward Brian, without anyone in the house consciously deciding that's what was happening. That's the entry, more than almost any other in that spreadsheet, that convinced me this wasn't really a story about a mother playing favorites on purpose. It was a story about a habit so deeply grooved into how our family moved money that it had stopped registering to the people living inside it as a choice at all. The down payment. In June of 2022, Brian and Denise bought a house. A genuinely nice one, 4 bedrooms in a subdivision called Cedar Run that had gone up fast on the edge of town, with a 2-car garage and a stone-faced entryway that Denise photographed extensively for what had, by then, become a modest but active social media presence about our home journey. I saw the pictures before I heard any of the actual numbers. Denise posted a video of herself walking through the empty rooms in bare feet, captioned "Finally, our forever home," set to music, and I remember watching it on my phone in the school pickup line and feeling something twist in my stomach that I didn't examine closely enough at the time. I found out the actual figures almost a year later, in April of 2023, during a conversation with my mother that started out being about something else entirely. She'd called to ask if Daniel and I wanted to split the cost of a group gift for my father's upcoming retirement, and veered, the way her calls often did, into an update on Brian's life. "They got such a good deal on that house," she said. "We were able to help with a good chunk of the down payment, which really made the difference for them qualifying." "How much was the down payment, if you don't mind me asking?" I said, keeping my voice light. $45,000, she said. "Well, we gave 40, they had the rest saved." $40,000. I sat with that number for the rest of the phone call, only half listening as my mother moved on to a story about the church's new choir director. $40,000 was more than Daniel and I had spent, cumulatively, on both of our cars combined. It was close to a full year of Maya's eventual college tuition, if she went where I hoped she'd go. It was money my parents had, apparently simply had available, sitting somewhere, ready to be given the same parents who, 3 years earlier, had told me they didn't want to be a burden on me by asking me to be their power of attorney. The same parents whose monthly HELOC payment I knew, from an offhand comment my mother had made, was still being paid entirely out of their own income because Brian's pressure washing business had never repaid a cent of the $62,000 it had borrowed. I didn't ask for anything. I want to be completely honest about that because it matters to the rest of this story. At no point did I want my parents' money. What I wanted, what I realized, sitting in my kitchen with my phone still warm against my ear, I had wanted for years without letting myself name it, was for the story my parents told about our family to match the actual math of our family. I wanted the ledger to balance. That's all. It's a small thing to want, and it's also, it turns out, one of the hardest things in the world to get from people who have spent 30 years building their peace on top of a ledger that doesn't. Grandma Sophie. My grandmother Sophie died in July of 2022, 13 months before my father's retirement, after a short decline that put her in Willow Creek Nursing Home for the last 4 months of her life. She'd left a modest estate, the small house she'd lived in since my grandfather died in 1998, about $30,000 in savings, and a life insurance policy worth $20,000 more to be split, according to her will, equally between my father and his sister, Aunt Pat. I wasn't involved in settling the estate. That fell to my father and Pat, as it should have, and I only mention it here because of something that happened at the funeral reception, held in the church hall at Immaculate Heart, with the same folding tables and the same slightly too strong coffee my whole life seemed to run on whenever our family gathered to grieve or celebrate. Brian pulled me aside near the coffee urn, which was unusual. Brian rarely sought me out for anything beyond the required minimum of family small talk, and told me, in a lowered voice, that he was going through a rough patch and asked if I thought Dad would be willing to advance him some of his eventual inheritance early, since Grandma's stuff is getting split up anyway. I asked him, as neutrally as I could manage at my own grandmother's funeral, what kind of rough patch. Denise's hours got cut back, he said, and I've got some stuff with the truck. It's nothing major, but it's tight right now. I told him I didn't think it was my place to weigh in on how Dad handled Grandma's estate, which was true, and which was also, if I'm honest, a way of not saying the thing I actually thought, which was, you have asked our parents for money in some form nearly every year of your adult life, and I am standing at our grandmother's funeral watching you calculate whether her death has created an opportunity. I don't know for certain whether that early advance happened. I know that 6 weeks later, at a small family dinner to divide up some of Grandma's furniture and belongings, Brian and Denise left with a great deal more than I did. Not that I wanted much. A set of her recipe cards was really the only thing I asked for, and I know that my mother mentioned, in December of that year, that Brian and Denise had gotten some help getting current on some bills without specifying the source of the help. I didn't push. I was still, at that point, choosing not to push, because pushing had never once, in my entire life, changed the outcome. It had only ever changed how I felt while watching the outcome unfold, and I decided somewhere along the way that feeling worse while changing nothing wasn't a trade I wanted to keep making. That would change, but not yet. The wedding invitation. Aunt Pat's daughter, my cousin Jenna, got married in October of 2022, 3 months after my grandmother's funeral, in a ceremony at a vineyard outside town that Pat had been planning, by her own cheerful admission, since Jenna was in middle school. Pat was 64 that year, a retired school secretary with an encyclopedic memory for family history and absolutely no filter about sharing it, which made her, depending on the occasion, either the most entertaining person at any gathering or the most dangerous one to stand next to during a lull in conversation. I want to introduce her properly here, because she matters more to this story than I think she ever realized at the time. Pat had been close to my grandmother, closer than my father in some ways, and she'd watched our family's dynamics unfold from just outside them for 4 decades, near enough to see clearly, far enough to never feel she had the standing to say anything. Her husband Walt, a retired postal worker, mostly stayed quiet at family events, content to let Pat do the talking for both of them, though he had a dry, understated sense of humor that occasionally cut through her chatter with a single perfectly timed sentence. At the wedding reception, seated at the same table as Pat and Walt while Daniel danced with Maya nearby, Pat leaned over to me during a slow song and said, in the lowered voice she used for her most serious gossip, "You know your grandmother worried about you kids. Not in a bad way. She just used to say Frank had a blind spot the size of Ohio when it came to your brother, and that someday somebody was going to have to point it out to him, because he sure wasn't going to see it on his own." "Did she ever say anything to him directly?" I asked. Pat shook her head. "Once, I think, years ago, not long after Brian's first car got wrecked. She told me Frank got quiet and changed the subject, and she never brought it up again. Your grandmother picked her battles. She'd tell you that was wisdom. I always thought it was more like exhaustion, if I'm honest, but I loved her too much to argue about the difference." I asked Pat carefully whether she'd known about the extent of the financial help. The truck, the down payment rumors that had started circulating by then, though not yet in the specific numbers I'd eventually find. Pat's face did something complicated, caught between loyalty to her brother and an honesty she clearly couldn't fully suppress. "I know it's more than anybody talks about at dinner," she said. "I don't know the whole of it. I don't think your parents know the whole of it either, if I'm being truthful. That's usually how it goes with something like that. Everybody sees their own piece, and nobody adds it all the way up, because adding it up would mean somebody has to say something out loud, and nobody in this family has ever been especially good at that." I danced with my father later that night, at Pat's gentle insistence. "Go on, he won't ask you himself." And for 3 minutes, swaying slowly to a song neither of us particularly liked, I let myself simply be his daughter at a wedding, without doing any of the math I'd already quietly, without fully admitting it to myself yet, begun to do in the back of my mind. It would be another 5 months before I found the spreadsheet. But Pat's words at that reception planted something in me that never quite went dormant again. The confirmation, from an outside witness, that I wasn't imagining a pattern that had been invisible to everyone but me. Other people had seen it too. They had simply, each in their own way, decided it wasn't their battle to pick. The group chat. There's a family group chat, started years ago by my mother, called Kowalski Crew, where birthdays get announced and photos get shared, and occasionally, logistics for holidays get hashed out among 6 or 7 people typing over each other. In January of 2023, I was added briefly to a different thread by accident. My mother meant to text Aunt Pat about something and instead sent the message to a group that still, from some old event, included me, Pat, and Denise. The message read, "Frank talked to the pension people today. Once he retires, the lump sum option comes to almost $210K if we take it instead of monthly payments. Don't say anything to Ren yet. I don't want her worrying about how we spend it. She gets funny about money stuff." I read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. Then I read it a third time, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, groceries still in the cart in the back seat, engine off, the January cold starting to seep into the car around me. She gets funny about money stuff. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I thought about 11 years of professional financial work, a CPA license, a controller title, a career built entirely on being the kind of person institutions trusted to handle exactly this sort of decision responsibly. And I thought about the fact that in my own family, that entire skill set had been recast, apparently, as a personality quirk. Getting funny about money. As though caring whether a $210,000 retirement decision was being made soundly was an eccentricity, like being picky about restaurants, rather than the single area of expertise I had spent my whole adult life building. I didn't respond in the group chat. I didn't want my mother to know I'd seen it, not yet, not until I understood more about what I was looking at. I called Daniel that night after the kids were asleep and told him what I'd read, and he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Ren, I think you need to start paying attention to this for real. Not just noticing it, paying attention." "I have been paying attention," I said. "You've been noticing," he said gently. "That's different from doing anything about it." He was right, and some part of me had known he'd be right before I even called him, which might be why I called him. Not for permission, exactly, but because I needed someone to say the thing out loud, so I could stop being able to pretend I hadn't already thought it myself. Maya's birthday. Maya turned 12 in October of 2022, a month before Jenna's wedding, and we held a small party at our house. A handful of her friends, a cake Daniel had attempted to decorate himself with mixed results, balloons taped haphazardly to the porch railing. My parents came, along with Brian and Denise, and it was, for the most part, an ordinary, pleasant afternoon, the kind of gathering I look back on now with a strange, complicated fondness, because I know now what none of us at that party yet fully knew. Denise arrived with a gift bag containing an expensive tablet, still in its box, the kind of gift that made my mother's eyebrows lift slightly and made me do the reflexive math I always did around anything involving money in that family. A habit I'd have called neutral curiosity at the time, though I understand now it had already, quietly, become vigilance. Denise mentioned, while we all sat on the porch afterward, that she and Brian were finally getting some breathing room, now that the mortgage thing had worked itself out. A phrase she delivered with the breezy vagueness of someone describing whether rather than a four-figure monthly obligation that had, unbeknownst to me at the time, just been quietly absorbed by my father's retirement account 6 months earlier. I remember feeling a small, sharp flicker of something at that comment, not yet suspicion exactly, more like a held breath, the kind you take right before a question you're not ready to ask out loud. I let it pass. Maya blew out her candles. My father took the good kind of photograph, the unposed kind, of Maya laughing at something Theo had said. And for the rest of that afternoon, I set the flicker aside and simply enjoyed my daughter's birthday, the way, I think, most people in difficult families learn to do, holding two truths at once: the good afternoon and the quiet unease underneath it, without letting either one cancel out the other. It's one of the last purely easy family gatherings I can remember before everything started to surface. I've thought about that timing often, how the discovery process, once it began in earnest a few months later, seemed to retroactively color every memory that came before it, turning ordinary birthday cake and porch conversation into evidence I hadn't known I was collecting. I don't think that's a flaw in my memory. I think it's just what happens when you finally get the missing piece of a puzzle. Every other piece you'd already placed suddenly looks slightly different, even though nothing about them has actually changed. The favor. The favor came in March of 2023, 3 months before my father's retirement date, and it came from my father himself, which was rare enough that I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when he called. "I've got all this retirement paperwork," he said, sounding tired in a way I didn't often hear from him. "The pension election forms, the 401k rollover stuff, some tax questions from the accountant Ridgeline uses. Your mother doesn't understand any of it, and neither do I, honestly. Would you look it over, just to make sure we're not missing anything?" I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. I want to be honest about how it felt in that moment, a warmth, almost embarrassing in its intensity, at being asked. 42 years old, a controller with a department of 8 people under me, and some small part of me still lit up like a kid at being handed a task by my father, being trusted, finally, with the thing I was actually good at. He dropped off a box of paperwork the following Saturday, actual paper, printed statements, forms half filled out, the accumulated financial residue of 40 years of work. I spent the better part of 2 weekends going through it at my kitchen table after the kids were in bed, and it was somewhere in that second weekend, cross-referencing a 401k statement against a pension election form, that I first noticed something that didn't add up. The 401k statement showed a balance of $187,340 as of the previous quarter. But an earlier statement, from 18 months before, tucked into the same folder, showed a balance of $241,600. And in between, I could find no record of a market downturn severe enough to explain a $54,000 drop, especially not in an account that, from what I could tell, was invested conservatively in target date funds that hadn't moved nearly that much. I called my father and asked him about it, as carefully and unalarmingly as I could manage. "Dad, did you take a loan against the 401k at some point? Or a hardship withdrawal? I'm just trying to reconcile a gap between two statements." There was a pause on the line, longer than the question warranted. "There might have been something," he said finally. "Your mother handled some of that with Brian's help, honestly. I wasn't as on top of it as I should have been. Things were stressful for a while there. Remember when Brian and Denise were having trouble with the mortgage? I hadn't known Brian and Denise had ever had trouble with their mortgage. This was the first I was hearing of it. How much was the withdrawal, Dad? I don't remember exactly. 50 maybe. Your mother would know better. $50,000, pulled from my father's retirement account. An account that existed to support him and my mother for the rest of their lives, with my father unable to tell me, with any real certainty, how much had been taken or exactly where it had gone. I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with anger yet. It was closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that a structure you'd assumed was stable had actually been hollowed out for years, and you were only now, belatedly, standing on the part that hadn't yet given way. The line I didn't cross. I went to see my mother alone, without Daniel, without the kids, on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, while my father was still at work. I told myself I was going to ask calm, factual questions, the way I'd ask them of any client whose books didn't reconcile. I told myself I wasn't going to accuse anyone of anything, because I genuinely didn't yet know what had happened. A loan, a gift, a series of loans that had quietly become gifts through nobody ever asking for the money back. I just wanted to understand the shape of it. My mother made tea, the way she always did when a conversation felt like it might require ceremony, and we sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once stood holding my college acceptance letter, waiting to be looked at. Dad mentioned there was a withdrawal from his 401k, I said. About 50,000. He said you and Brian handled it. I'm trying to understand the details, just so I can help him file everything correctly for retirement. My mother's hands went still around her mug. It wasn't 50, she said. It was closer to 60, with the penalties factored in, because he wasn't old enough yet to take it without a penalty. Brian and Denise were behind on their mortgage, 3 months behind. The bank was talking about foreclosure paperwork. We couldn't just let that happen to your brother's house, Rennie. Was it a loan? Is there a repayment plan? It's family, Rennie. There it was again, the same 2 words, the same closing argument she'd used about the HELOC, deployed now to cover an amount large enough to meaningfully change my parents' retirement. We're not going to sit down and draw up a contract with our own son. You had one with a stranger, though, I said, more sharply than I meant to. The bank has a contract with you for the HELOC. Ridgeline had a contract with Dad for 40 years of employment. The pension plan has a contract. It's not that families can't have agreements, Mom. It's that you keep deciding Brian is the one exception to every single agreement in this family, and I stopped myself. I could feel the old pull, the gravitational one, toward apologizing before I'd even finished the sentence, toward softening it into something she could accept without having to actually reckon with it. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face closed, the way a door closes, not slammed, just quietly, firmly shut. You've always kept score, she said. Even as a little girl. I don't know where that came from. Your father and I have never loved either of you more than the other. We've just given each of you what you needed, and you never needed as much. I didn't say anything else. I finished my tea because leaving it unfinished felt, somehow, like it would have been its own kind of accusation, and then I drove home and sat in my driveway for 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside and be a normal person for my kids. You never needed as much. I would turn that sentence over so many times in the months that followed that it wore smooth, like a stone in a pocket, and it would take me a long time to understand that it wasn't actually a defense of fairness. It was a redefinition of the word, one where need justified everything, and where my own decades of not needing, of engineering a life specifically so I wouldn't need, had been quietly recategorized, this whole time, as evidence that I didn't deserve equal consideration in the first place. If this is the kind of story that resonates with you, the quiet kind, where nobody's a cartoon villain and the wound is made of 1,000 small decisions instead of one big one, stay with me, because it gets harder before it gets better. And if you haven't yet, this is a good moment to hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. The spreadsheet. In April of 2023, about 10 weeks before my father's retirement party, he asked me for help one more time. His old laptop had died, and he needed his tax documents and retirement paperwork moved onto the new one my mother had bought him for his birthday. I offered to do it myself, since I understood file systems better than either of them, and my father, tired and a little overwhelmed by the whole retirement process, was glad to hand it off. I plugged the old laptop's hard drive into an external enclosure at my own kitchen table, planning to just copy the relevant folders across, and it was there, in a folder my mother had apparently created and labeled simply Family, that I found the spreadsheet. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It wasn't password protected or buried in some obscure directory. It was sitting in plain sight, the way things often are when the person keeping them has never imagined anyone else would think to look, an Excel file called Brian Help. XLSX, last modified 2 months earlier, evidently kept by my mother, in her own careful, old-fashioned way, as a personal record of every time she and my father had given Brian money going back to 2015. I opened it expecting maybe a page. It was 11 pages long. Line after line, dated and itemized in my mother's handwriting-turned-typing style, full of small notes to herself. March 2016, $4,000, car repair, Brian said he'd pay back by June, never did. August 2017, $6,500, gym membership buyout when he left the trade. January 2019, $2,200, credit card, told him this was the last time. November 2019, $8,000, emergency, never got details on what for. And on, through the pandemic years, through the pressure washing franchise, through the truck, through the mortgage rescue, through the house down payment. There it was, in black and white, an entry dated February 2023, $401K withdrawal, $61,400 after penalties, mortgage arrears plus back taxes he didn't tell us about until the IRS letter came. At the bottom of the 11th page, my mother had typed a running total. Not a total of money given, a total of money my parents had given Brian and Denise, cumulatively, since 2015, set against a much shorter, much smaller column labeled, almost as an afterthought, Rennie, which contained exactly 2 entries. A $500 wedding gift in 2009, and a $200 contribution toward Maya's christening in 2011. The total for Brian's column, as of that February entry, was $198,740. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I found it, the external hard drive still humming quietly beside my laptop, the numbers sitting on the screen in front of me in a plain, ordinary font, as though a number that large could ever look ordinary. I want to tell you I felt vindicated. Mostly what I felt was a strange, hollow grief, the specific grief of discovering that the thing you'd suspected for years, the thing you'd talked yourself out of 100 times because surely it couldn't be that bad, had in fact been exactly that bad, and had been sitting quietly in a file called Family the entire time, keeping its own precise, honest record while the family itself told a much softer story out loud. I didn't cry. I want to be truthful with you about that, because I think it matters to how the rest of this goes. I closed the laptop, sat with my hands flat on the kitchen table for a few minutes, and then I did the only thing that had ever made sense to me when the world stopped making sense. I opened a blank document and started writing down a timeline. Who I told first. I called Daniel before I told anyone else, obviously, and he came home early from school that day, and we sat together at the kitchen table while I walked him through the spreadsheet on my laptop, page by page. He didn't say much while I talked. That's one of the things I've always loved about him. He knows the difference between a moment that needs advice and a moment that just needs a witness. When I finished, he asked one question: "What do you want to happen?" I didn't have an answer yet, and I told him so. I said I didn't want to destroy my parents financially or take anything away from them. I said I didn't even know, honestly, if I wanted anything from Brian. I wasn't sure this was fixable in the sense of numbers evening back out. What I wanted, I said, slowly working it out loud for the first time, was for the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. I wanted my parents to have to look directly at what they'd done, instead of being allowed to keep narrating it to themselves and everyone else as ordinary, unremarkable family generosity. The next person I told was my best friend, Yolanda, who I'd known since our first week at Ohio State and who worked, by coincidence or maybe not, in human resources for a hospital system. A job that had given her a very specific expertise in documentation, in the particular way institutions require proof before they'll act on a claim, no matter how obviously true that claim might feel to the person making it. We met at a coffee shop near her office, and I showed her photos I'd taken of the spreadsheet on my phone. "This is financial elder abuse," she said, flatly, before I'd even finished explaining the context. I know that's a hard phrase to hear about your own parents, but if a coworker described this to me about an elderly relative and an adult child, that's the term I'd use, no question. I flinched at the phrase. I still flinch at it a little now, honestly, even having lived through everything that came after. My parents weren't cruel to me. My father never raised a hand to either of us. My mother never withheld love in any way I could point to and call abuse in the way I'd always understood the word. But Yolanda wasn't talking about how they'd treated me. She was talking about a pattern, an adult child systematically extracting resources from aging parents. Sometimes with those parents' willing participation, and sometimes, possibly, past the point where that participation was fully informed. And about what that pattern is called when you strip the family love story away from it and just look at the transactions. I saw a therapist for the first time in my life that May, a woman named Dr. Elena Torres who specialized in family systems, on Yolanda's recommendation. In our first session, I told her the whole history, Larkspur Avenue, the paint cans, the POA, the spreadsheet, and she said something that I've carried with me since. "You've spent your whole life being the reliable one," she said, "and reliability, in a family like yours, isn't just a trait. It's a role you were assigned so early you probably don't remember being assigned it. The question you're facing now isn't just about the money. It's about whether you're willing to stop performing the role, even when performing it has kept you safe for 40 years. I asked her what "stop performing it" would even look like. She said she couldn't tell me that was mine to figure out, but she could help me figure out what I was actually afraid would happen if I did. What I was afraid of, it turned out, once we dug into it over several sessions, wasn't losing my parents' love exactly. It was losing the specific shape of belonging I'd built my whole identity around, being the daughter who didn't cause problems, who could be counted on, who never needed managing. I'd built that identity, brick by brick, since I was 11 years old in a hardware store parking lot, and some part of me understood, sitting in Dr. Torres' office in May of 2023, that confronting what I'd found meant demolishing that identity on purpose, with no guarantee anything better would be standing in its place afterward. I decided to do it anyway. Not recklessly, I want to be clear about that, because recklessness has never been who I am, and it wasn't who I was going to become just because I was angry. I decided to do it carefully, the way I did everything, with documentation and a plan and people in my corner who knew what they were talking about. I made an appointment with an estate and elder law attorney named Margaret Chen the following week, and I also called a financial advisor, Doug Preston, who Halstead Freight used for our own corporate retirement plan, and asked him, off the clock and as a friend, to walk me through what my parents' actual financial exposure looked like if the pattern I'd found continued unchecked into their retirement years. "Best case," Doug told me, after I sent him the numbers stripped of names, "your parents are looking at running out of money in 9, maybe 10 years, assuming no further withdrawals. Worst case, if this pattern continues even at half the rate it's been going, 5 years. 5 years and they're 68 and 66 right now. That's not a hypothetical old age problem. That's within a normal life expectancy." I sat with that number, 5 years, for a long time after I hung up with Doug. It reframed everything for me. This had stopped being, in my mind, a story about fairness between siblings. It had become a story about whether my parents would have enough money to survive their own old age, and whether anyone besides me was going to say that plainly, out loud, before it was too late to change course. Sam Whitfield's question, the one person I hadn't expected to consult, but ended up leaning on more than almost anyone outside my immediate family, was Sam Whitfield, my father's old colleague and eventual successor at Ridgeline, a man I'd known distantly my whole life through my father's stories about the plant, and who had, entirely by coincidence, also become something of a professional mentor to me years earlier. After we met at an industry event, and discovered we shared the specific, dry sense of humor that seems to develop in people who spend their careers making numbers behave. I called Sam in early May, not entirely sure why, except that he was one of the few people who understood both the financial dimension of what I'd found and the specific culture of my father's world. The plant floor, the pension structure, the particular pride men like my father took in retiring with something solid to show for 40 years of showing up. Sam listened to the whole story over coffee at a diner near the plant, and when I finished, he asked me a question that none of the professionals had thought to ask. "What does your dad think retiring well actually means to him?" Sam said. "Not what the paperwork says. What does it mean to Frank Kowalski, specifically the man you grew up with?" I didn't have a ready answer. Sam had one, though. He'd worked beside my father for 30 years, had watched him mentor young hires, had seen him turn down 2 promotions to regional management specifically so he could stay close to the floor, close to the men he supervised, rather than move into an office removed from the work itself. "Your dad's whole identity is built on being someone people can count on," Sam said. "The guys on that floor used to say if Frank Kowalski told you something would get fixed, it got fixed, full stop, no excuses. I think the hardest part of what you found isn't going to be the money for him. It's going to be realizing he wasn't the reliable one in his own house the way he thought he was, that some of what he built his whole self-image on turned out to have a blind spot right in the middle of it. You're not just handing him a financial problem, Rennie. You're handing him a mirror. Be ready for him to need some time before he can look into it without flinching." That conversation changed how I approached the entire rest of the process. It's part of why, when I finally handed my father the folder at the party, I didn't say anything that framed it as an accusation. It's part of why, in the weeks that followed, I gave him room to call me on his own timeline rather than pushing for an immediate response. Sam had understood something about my father that even Dr. Torres, skilled as she was, couldn't have known without 30 years on a factory floor beside him. That for a man like Frank Kowalski, the reckoning wasn't going to be about dollars first. It was going to be about identity, and identity, in my experience by then, always took longer to repair than any spreadsheet. Margaret Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a converted mill building downtown, all exposed brick and tall windows, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked almost typed. When I finished, she set her pen down and asked me a series of questions that felt, in the moment, almost clinical, and that I've come to understand were exactly the right questions. Was my father of sound mind? Yes, unquestionably, sharp, present, entirely himself, just trusting in a way that had been exploited. Had he signed anything under duress or while incapacitated? The POA had been signed in the hospital, sedated, which she flagged immediately as potentially problematic, though not necessarily invalid. She'd need to review the actual document and the circumstances more closely. Had money been given as gifts or loans? Almost entirely undocumented, which she said, with a small, tired sigh I recognized from my own work, was extremely common and extremely difficult to claw back after the fact, precisely because families don't write things down when they trust each other, and then the not writing it down becomes its own kind of evidence that nothing was ever owed. "Here's what I can tell you plainly," she said. "You cannot force your parents to want their money back. If they are of sound mind, and it sounds like they are, this is legally almost entirely their choice to make, even if it's a choice that worries you. What I can help you with is making sure any future decisions, especially around that power of attorney and around their wills and beneficiary designations, are made with full information and proper documentation, so that whatever happens next happens because your parents actually chose it with clear eyes, rather than happening again by default, the way it seems to have happened every time before." She recommended, gently, that I request, not demand, request, a formal accounting of the 401k withdrawal, since that account had originally listed both my father's estate and, in an old beneficiary form from years earlier, my mother and both children as contingent beneficiaries. She also recommended, more pointedly, that given what I described about the hospital bed signing, someone should review whether the existing power of attorney had been properly executed, and whether my father, now fully recovered and of sound mind, might want to revisit who held that authority. "You're not trying to punish anyone," she told me as I was leaving. "You're trying to make sure the next 20 years of your parents' life happen on purpose instead of by accident. That's a very different goal than revenge, and I'd encourage you to hold on to that difference, because your family is going to try very hard to convince you they're the same thing." I wrote that sentence down on the drive home, dictating it into my phone at a red light so I wouldn't lose it. It would turn out to be the single most useful thing anyone said to me during the entire ordeal, because she was right. My family would try, over and over, in the months that followed, to collapse the distance between accountability and cruelty, to make me believe that wanting the truth acknowledged was the same thing as wanting to hurt them. Holding on to the difference, quietly, privately, in my own mind, turned out to be the thing that let me stay calm when everything else in the room was on fire. Doug Preston's spreadsheet. Doug Preston, the financial advisor Halstead Freight used for our corporate plan, had known me for 6 years by the time I called him about my parents. Mostly through quarterly review meetings where he'd walk our leadership team through fund performance in the specific, unhurried voice of a man who'd long ago stopped finding numbers dramatic. He was 50 that year, silver-haired, the kind of person who kept a framed photo of his own parents on his desk, and I'd later learn had gone through a not dissimilar reckoning with his own brother a decade earlier, which was part of why, when I called him, he didn't sound surprised so much as quietly, familiarly grieved. I sent him the numbers stripped of names, my father's remaining 401k balance, the pension's 2 payout options, the HELOC balance and its terms, my parents' fixed monthly expenses, their Social Security estimates. He built a simple model, the same kind he built for corporate retirement projections, and walked me through it over the phone on a Thursday evening while Daniel put the kids to bed. "Here's the thing about a plan like this," he said. "It's not that your parents are broke. They're not yet. It's that they've been treating an asset that has to last 20, 25 years like it was a checking account with an infinite refill button. Every withdrawal looked survivable in the moment it happened, because it always is in the moment. It's only when you run the whole thing forward, year by year, that you see it stops working." He showed me 2 versions of the model. In one, the pattern continued at even half its historical rate, a modest ongoing, help here and there, nothing as dramatic as the 401k withdrawal, just the ordinary drip of smaller loans and gifts continuing the way they always had. In that version, my parents' liquid savings ran out in year 5, leaving them dependent entirely on Social Security and whatever was left of the pension, in a house that still carried a HELOC payment neither income stream comfortably covered. In the other version, no further withdrawals, the HELOC refinanced into a fixed schedule, modest part-time income for a few years. They had a real, if leaner, retirement that lasted comfortably into their 80s. The difference between those 2 futures isn't really about Brian, Doug told me, near the end of the call. It's about whether anyone in the family is willing to treat this money like what it actually is instead of what everyone wants it to feel like. Money doesn't care about family loyalty, Rennie. It just does what the math says it's going to do, whether anyone's watching or not. I printed both versions of his model and put them in the folder, side by side, the closest thing to a crystal ball I could offer my father, not a guilt trip, not an accusation, just 2 roads laid out plainly, so that whatever he chose, he'd be choosing it with his eyes fully open for what might be the first time in this entire story. A timeline of my own. Over the next 6 weeks, in the evenings after my kids went to bed, I built the document that would eventually end up in a manila folder at the Fairview Country Club. I didn't set out, at first, to build something I'd ever show anyone. I told myself I was just organizing my own understanding, the way I'd organize a messy set of company books, putting everything in chronological order, cross-referencing dates, making sure every claim I believed was true had a piece of paper behind it. I requested, through Margaret, copies of the 401k plan's transaction history, which I was entitled to see as a named contingent beneficiary on the older form that had never been updated. I photographed every page of my mother's, Brian Help, spreadsheet the day I found it, and I cross-referenced her handwritten dates against bank statements my father let me pull up on his online banking portal while helping him, get more comfortable with the new laptop. A cover story that was true in a narrow, technical sense, and also, I'll admit, served a second purpose I didn't mention to him. I found the HELOC documents in a drawer at their house one afternoon while ostensibly looking for his old tax returns. I found the truck loan co-signing paperwork the same way. By the end of May, I had a folder, a real one, physical, with tabs organized into sections. Section 1, the power of attorney, signed under sedation, with a note from Margaret about its questionable execution. Section 2, the HELOC, $62,000, unpaid, still being serviced entirely from my parents' income. Section 3, the truck loan co-signature and its impact on my parents' credit exposure. Section 4, the down payment, $40,000, documented through a bank transfer record my mother had, ironically, kept a paper copy of for taxes. Section 5, the 401k withdrawal, $61,400 after penalties, the single largest hit to their retirement security, taken without my father, by his own admission, fully understanding what he'd signed. And a final section, a single page, that was simply a photocopy of my mother's spreadsheet. Its own 11 pages reduced to one clean printed summary. Total documented financial support to Brian and Denise since 2015, $198,740 against $270. I updated my own will and beneficiary designations during this same period, on Margaret's advice, formalizing guardianship arrangements for Maya and Theo, and making sure nothing in my own affairs depended on assumptions the way my parents' affairs apparently had. I opened a separate savings account, in my name only, that had nothing to do with distrust of Daniel. He knew about it and thought it was a reasonable idea, but everything to do with a feeling I couldn't fully articulate yet, a need to know that at least one financial structure in my life was entirely, unambiguously mine, answerable to no one's narrative but my own. I talked to Maya, who was 13 that spring, in an age-appropriate way about money and fairness, not the specifics of what was happening with my parents, but the general shape of it, the idea that love in a family should show up in ways you could actually see and count on, and that it was okay to notice, and to say something if it didn't. I don't know exactly why I felt that conversation was urgent that particular spring, except that I understood, on some level, that I was trying to build in my own daughter something nobody had built in me until I was 42 years old and sitting at a kitchen table with an external hard drive. What I did not do during those 6 weeks was confront anyone. I didn't tell Brian I knew. I didn't tell my parents I'd seen the spreadsheet. I went to 2 more family dinners, sat through updates about Denise's new kitchen backsplash and Brian's latest business idea, a mobile detailing service this time, and I smiled and asked reasonable follow-up questions and drove home afterward feeling like I was fluent in a language everyone else believed was my native tongue and that I now understood, for the first time, I'd only ever been performing. The guest list. My father's retirement date was set for the last Friday in July, and my mother, with Denise's enthusiastic help, spent the early summer planning a party to market. Not a small family gathering, but a real event, rented out at the Fairview Country Club, 200 guests, Ridgeline colleagues going back decades, church friends, extended family from 3 states. Denise had, by her own admission at a planning dinner I attended in June, basically taken over the whole thing, down to selecting the caterer and designing a slideshow of photos from my father's 40 years at the plant. I offered to help with the budget, since event budgets were, professionally speaking, exactly the kind of thing I did for a living. My mother told me, with what I now recognize as a rehearsed kind of gentleness, that Denise and Brian had really wanted to handle this one as their gift to your dad, and that my help wasn't needed on the money side, though of course I was welcome to help however else I liked. I offered to make a toast. My mother said the toasts were already being handled. Brian was doing one, and Frank's old plant manager, Sam Whitfield's predecessor, was doing another, and there just wasn't a natural slot left for a third. I noticed, without yet fully admitting to myself what I was noticing, that I was being organized out of my own father's retirement party with the same soft, deniable efficiency with which I'd been organized out of most things in this family for 40 years. The tension came to a head 2 weeks before the party, at what was meant to be a casual dinner at my parents' house. I'd decided by then that I couldn't sit through the party itself without saying something first. Some part of me still believed, I think, that if I approached my parents privately, calmly, with everything laid out clearly, they might actually hear me before the party ever happened, and none of what came later would need to happen at all. I asked to speak with my father and mother alone after dinner, once Brian and Denise had left, and I told them, as gently as I knew how, that I'd found some financial discrepancies while helping with the retirement paperwork, and that I thought, before the party, before any more decisions got made about the pension lump sum or anything else, we should sit down properly, maybe even with Margaret or with Doug, and get a clear picture of where things actually stood. My father went quiet in a way that worried me more than anger would have. My mother's face did the thing I'd seen in the kitchen in March, that closing, that quiet shutting of a door. "You went through our private financial records," my mother said. "It wasn't a question." "I was fixing Dad's laptop," I said. "I found a spreadsheet you made yourself, Mom. I didn't go looking for anything. But once I saw it, I couldn't just pretend I hadn't." "This is your father's retirement," she said. "This is supposed to be a celebration of 40 years of work, and you want to turn it into an audit." "I don't want to turn the party into anything," I said. "I'm asking for a private conversation, before the party, so nothing needs to happen at the party at all." My father finally spoke. "Rennie," he said, and his voice had none of the warmth it usually carried when he said my name, "I think you need to let this go. Whatever we've done for your brother is between us and him. It doesn't cost you anything." "It might cost you your retirement, Dad," I said. "That's the part I'm actually worried about." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the thing that, more than anything else in this entire story, told me exactly where I stood. "I think it would be best," he said, quietly, "if you didn't come to the party." I sat in my car outside their house for 20 minutes after that, the way I had after the tea in March, except this time I wasn't confused about what had just happened. I understood it completely. I had, for the first time in my life, said a true, necessary, uncomfortable thing directly to my parents' faces, without softening it into apology, and their response had been to remove me from the guest list of the single most significant public event of my father's life. What I decided in 2 weeks. I spent the 2 weeks between that dinner and the party going back and forth with myself more than I had at any point since finding the spreadsheet. Daniel and I talked about it almost every night. Dr. Torres and I spent an entire extended session on it. Yolanda, characteristically direct, told me she thought I had every right to show up and every right to stay home, and that the only wrong choice was doing either one out of fear instead of clarity. What settled it for me, in the end, wasn't anger. It was something closer to responsibility, the specific, quiet responsibility of being, as far as I could tell, the only person in this entire family who had all the pieces of the picture at once, and who understood, in real financial terms, what my parents' next 10 years actually looked like if this pattern went unaddressed. I thought about Doug's 5-year estimate. I thought about my father, 73, 75, with no pension left, and a paid-off house remortgaged into a HELOC he'd never see repaid, needing help my mother and I both knew, deep down, that Brian would not reliably be able to provide. I decided that whatever social cost I paid for showing up uninvited to say a true thing in front of witnesses was smaller than the cost of staying silent while my parents walked, smiling, directly into that future. I didn't decide to make a scene. I want to be very clear about that because it matters enormously to how the actual night went. I decided to attend, to find a quiet moment, and to hand my father, not shout at him, not announce to 200 people, but physically hand him the folder I'd built, along with a short, calm statement of what was in it and why I thought he needed to see it before the pension lump sum decision, which Doug had confirmed was still not yet finalized, went through. I told Daniel my plan. I told Margaret, who advised me, wisely, to bring a printed copy for my father, a printed copy for myself in case anything needed clarifying later, and to say as little as possible beyond handing over the documents and stating my intent plainly. I did not tell my parents I was coming. I understand, looking back, why that reads as provocative to some people who have heard this story. I've gotten that comment more than once. My answer is always the same. I had already tried the version where I told them ahead of time, calmly, privately, 2 weeks earlier, and their response had been to remove me from the guest list rather than engage with a single piece of what I'd found. I didn't believe a second private conversation would go any differently. What I believed, what I needed, honestly, for my own sense of integrity, was for the truth to exist in a room my parents couldn't simply close the door on. The Fairview Country Club. The party was held in the club's main ballroom, a big, warmly lit space with a wall of windows looking out over the ninth fairway, round tables dressed in white linen, a slideshow of my father's 40 years at Ridgeline looping on a screen near the head table. I arrived about 45 minutes in, deliberately, so the room would already be settled, people at their tables with drinks in hand, the formal parts of the evening not yet begun. I wore the navy dress I'd bought 2 weeks before, and I carried the folder in a plain black portfolio, and I walked in through the main doors like any other guest, because as far as the club itself was concerned, I was. I found my father near the edge of the room, away from the head table, talking to Sam Whitfield, his old friend and eventual successor as plant supervisor. A heavyset man of about 60 with kind eyes and an easy laugh that stopped abruptly when he saw my father's face change as I approached. "Rennie," my father said my name the way you'd say a word you weren't expecting to need that night. "You weren't, I didn't think you were coming." "I know," I said. "I'm not here to cause a problem, Dad. I'm here because I couldn't let tonight happen without you having this." I held out the portfolio. "It's everything I told you about 2 weeks ago, written down with the documents behind it so you don't have to take my word for anything. I think you should look at it before you finalize the pension decision. That's all I came to say." He didn't take it right away. Sam, to his credit, took a discreet step back but didn't leave entirely. I think, looking back, he sensed something was happening that his old friend might need a witness for, even a quiet one. My mother appeared beside my father almost immediately, drawn, I think, by some instinct mothers have for exactly the wrong moment in a room. "What is this?" she said, looking at the portfolio, then at me, her voice pitched low but sharp. "Rennie, you cannot do this here. Tonight of all nights." "I'm not doing anything, Mom. I'm handing Dad an envelope." "You are humiliating him," she said, and I watched her glance, quickly, toward the head table, where Brian had just noticed the three of us and was starting to make his way over with the particular fast, purposeful walk of a man sensing a threat to something he'd rather not examine too closely. I said the line then, the one from the video, the one that made its way around that Facebook group, the one I'd practiced in my car. I said it quietly, not for the room, only for the three of them standing right in front of me. "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone. I'm trying to make sure that 40 years of hard work doesn't quietly disappear because nobody in this family was willing to write anything down." Brian arrived in time to hear the last part of it. "What is going on?" he said, and then, seeing the portfolio in my father's hands, which he'd finally, reluctantly, taken from me, "What is that?" "It's a summary," I said, still calm, still quiet, "of everything Mom and Dad have given you since 2015, and everything that's happened to Dad's retirement accounts and the house equity in that same period. I built it because I love them, and because somebody in this family needed to have the whole picture in one place before Dad walks away from Ridgeline for good." Brian's face did something complicated. Anger, yes, but underneath it, for just a second, something that looked almost like fear, and I understood, watching it, that some part of him had always known exactly what the real total was, even if he'd never let himself add it up the way I had. "You're doing this now," he said. "At Dad's retirement party, are you serious right now?" "I tried doing it privately 2 weeks ago," I said. "You weren't there for that conversation, but Mom and Dad were, and their response was to take me off the guest list. So yes, I'm doing it now, because apparently now is the only time anyone in this family will actually stand still long enough to listen." My mother's voice rose, just slightly enough that a few nearby tables turned. "You need to leave," she said. "You are not going to ruin this for him." "I already gave him the folder, Mom," I said. "I'm not asking to speak. I'm not asking to make a toast. I'll go." And I meant it. I had already, before ever walking into that ballroom, decided that handing over the documents was the entirety of what I intended to do, that I wasn't there to stage a scene, only to make sure the truth had a physical location in the world that couldn't be argued out of existence later. But my mother had already turned toward the club's event coordinator, who was hovering near the entrance the way event staff do, alert to any disturbance in a room full of people who'd paid a great deal of money for the evening to go smoothly. And I watched her say something to him, low and urgent, and I watched him nod and speak into a small radio clipped to his lapel. Two men in navy polo shirts arrived within about 90 seconds, Fairview's evening security, the same men, I'd learn later, who mostly spent their shifts checking that nobody wandered into the pro shop after hours. One of them, an older man named Ray with a kind, tired face who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the assignment he'd been handed, approached me and said quietly, almost apologetically, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. You're not on tonight's guest list." "I understand," I said. I was already leaving. And I was. I turned calmly and walked toward the exit on my own steady feet, the folder already out of my hands and into my father's, the only thing I'd come to accomplish already accomplished, while 200 people I'd known most of my life watched a security guard walk 2 paces behind me across a ballroom floor, and somewhere near the head table, a phone was already recording. The morning after, I didn't hear from anyone in my family for 4 days after the party. Daniel had been waiting outside in the car. He'd insisted on driving me, sensing, correctly, that I might not be in a state to drive myself afterward, and when I got in, he didn't ask if I was okay in that first minute. He just reached over and held my hand while I sat there, staring at the club's brightly lit entrance, watching well-dressed people I'd known my whole life continue filing in past the spot where I'd just been walked out. I cried, finally, about halfway home, not from shame, though there was some of that too, mixed in, the specific, old shame of having been publicly marked as the family's problem, a label I'd spent 42 years avoiding. Mostly I cried from something closer to grief, the recognition that whatever had just happened in that ballroom was probably going to be the last time, for a long while, that I stood in the same room as my parents. The video surfaced online within about 18 hours, shared first in a local Facebook group for the town, and then more widely for a few days before it faded, the way these things do, into the churn of everything else on the internet. I saw it once, sent to me by a cousin who thought I should know it existed, and then I never watched it again. What struck me most in that one viewing wasn't how I looked, calm, if anything, calmer than I remembered feeling, but how young Ray, the security guard, looked in his discomfort, how visibly he didn't want to be doing what he was doing. And how, at one point just before I reached the door, he said something to me off camera that the video didn't pick up clearly but that I remembered perfectly. "For what it's worth, ma'am, whatever's in that envelope, I hope it does some good." On the 5th day, my father called. Just my father alone, which was its own kind of statement. "I read it," he said without preamble, "all of it twice." I didn't say anything. I let him have the silence. "I didn't know it was that much," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on that much, in a way I hadn't heard from him since I was a child. "I knew we'd helped him more than we helped you. I told myself it evened out somehow, that you didn't need it, that it wasn't really unequal because you were doing fine. I never sat down and actually added the numbers the way you did. Your mother did, I think, some part of her, which is maybe why she kept that spreadsheet in the first place. I don't think she ever showed it to anyone because some part of her already knew what it would look like laid out flat like that." "What do you want to do, Dad?" I asked, and I meant it as an open question, not a demand. "I don't know yet," he said. "I talked to that lawyer of yours, Margaret. Your mother's furious I talked to her without her, but I did it anyway. I asked her to look at the power of attorney. I think," he paused for a long time, "I think I want it to be you. Not because I don't love your brother. Because I trust you to tell me the truth even when it costs you something, and I don't think I can say that about very many other people in my life right now, including myself some days." I didn't say yes right away. I asked for a few days to think about it, partly because I genuinely needed the time, and partly because some old, careful part of me wanted my father to sit a little longer with the fact that trust like that has to be asked for, not simply assumed to be waiting there, unconditionally, the way it always had been before. My mother's silence, and what came after it. My mother didn't call for another 6 weeks. When she finally did, it wasn't an apology, not at first. It was an invitation to lunch, delivered in the same brisk, business-as-usual tone she used for arranging most things, as though the ballroom and the security guard and the 18 months of silence that preceded it had simply been an unusually long pause in an otherwise ordinary conversation. We met at a diner halfway between our two houses, neutral ground neither of us had any particular history with, which I think was deliberate on both our parts even though we never said so. She looked older than she had at the party, in a way that had nothing to do with 2 months passing and everything to do, I suspected, with whatever had actually happened inside her own reckoning during that silence. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't humiliated," she said, before I'd even finished ordering coffee. "You embarrassed your father and me in front of everyone we know." "I know that's how it felt," I said. I'd decided, going in, that I wasn't going to argue with her feelings, only with the story built on top of them. "I didn't do it to embarrass you. I did it because I'd already tried every private way I knew, and every private way ended with me being told to disappear until the inconvenient part of me went quiet again." She was silent for a while, turning a sugar packet over in her fingers. "Your grandmother used to say you were the one who noticed everything and said nothing," she said, finally. I always thought that was a compliment, the way she meant it. I'm starting to wonder if it was a warning and I just heard the part I wanted to hear. It wasn't an apology, not the clean kind you see in movies. But it was the first time in my entire life that my mother had said something that acknowledged, even obliquely, that the ledger between me and Brian had never been as balanced as the story she'd told herself required it to be. I didn't push for more that day. I'd learned by then that pushing rarely got me anything real from her. What got me something real was patience, and time, and the accumulated weight of small true moments like the sugar packet one, arriving on their own schedule rather than mine. She never fully agreed with everything in the folder. To this day, she maintains that some of what she gave Brian was, in her words, a mother's right to help her child. And I've stopped trying to win that particular argument because I understood, eventually, that what I actually needed from her wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement that the help had a cost, that the cost had landed disproportionately on one side of the family, and that going forward, decisions about money in that house would happen with both her children in the room, or at least with both her children informed, rather than one of them finding out 18 months later from a spreadsheet nobody meant for her to see. She did agree, that same lunch, to come with my father to a joint meeting with Margaret Chen the following week. It was the first time in the entire ordeal that both my parents sat in the same room with a professional and let the numbers speak without either of them softening them into a family story first. What Brian never said. Brian never called. Not that week, not that month, not for the better part of a year. I heard about his reactions secondhand, mostly through my mother, in the careful, edited way she'd learned to relay things to me by then. He was hurt. He felt ambushed. He thought I'd made him look like a villain in front of people he'd have to see at the grocery store for the rest of his life. Denise posted, about 2 weeks after the party, a long, vaguely worded message on her social media about toxic family dynamics and protecting your peace, which everyone who knew our family understood, without her ever using my name, exactly who it was about. I won't pretend that didn't sting. It did. I'd spent 40 years being cast as the responsible one, and now I was being cast, in a slightly updated version of the same play, as the toxic one, the disruptor, the person who couldn't let old wounds stay buried at a party where everyone else had agreed, tacitly, to leave them there. What surprised me, almost a year later, wasn't an apology from Brian either. He still hasn't given me one, not directly, not in so many words. What surprised me was a text message, out of nowhere, on a Tuesday in the following June that read, "Denise and I started seeing a financial counselor. It's been rough looking at all this honestly. I'm not saying you were right about everything, but I get why you were scared for them. I hope you're doing okay." I read it several times before I responded, the same way I'd read my mother's group chat message a year and a half earlier, except this time the vertigo I felt was a different kind, something closer to cautious hope than grief. I wrote back something simple. I told him I appreciated the message, that I hoped the counseling helped, and that I meant it when I said I never wanted to see him lose everything either. I just couldn't watch our parents lose everything on his behalf without saying something. We haven't fully repaired things, Brian and I, not in the neat way stories sometimes want you to believe families repair. But we've had 2 real conversations since that text, both careful, both a little stiff, both nonetheless more honest than almost any conversation we'd had with each other in the previous 15 years. I've come to think that's what repair often actually looks like in real families, not a single dramatic reconciliation, but a slow accumulation of smaller, truer exchanges, each one a little less guarded than the last, with no guarantee of where the total ends up. What Pat and Sam said afterward. Aunt Pat called me about 2 weeks after the party, the first person outside my immediate household to reach out. "I heard what happened," she said, without any preamble, which was very Pat. "I want you to know your grandmother would have been proud of you, and I mean that, even though I know your mother would skin me for saying it." I asked her, since she'd clearly heard some version of events already, what people were actually saying around town. She laughed, a little ruefully. "Half the church thinks you humiliated your poor parents for no reason. The other half thinks it's about time somebody in that family said something out loud. For what it's worth, I'm in the second half, and I always have been, even back at Jenna's wedding when I didn't have the nerve to say more than I did." Sam Whitfield reached out too, a few days later, not to weigh in on the family drama directly. He was careful, appropriately, to stay out of that, but to tell me that my father had come by the plant unannounced the week after the party, sat in Sam's office for the better part of an hour, and talked through the whole situation, out loud, for what Sam suspected was the first time my father had ever said any of it plainly to another person. "He asked me if I thought less of him," Sam told me. "I told him the only thing that would make me think less of him was if he already knew the truth and did nothing about it now that he had it in front of him. I told him you didn't build that folder to hurt him. You built it because you were the only one in the family willing to do the arithmetic nobody else wanted to do." He got quiet for a while after that. Then he thanked me and went back to work, same as any other Tuesday, except I don't think it was really the same, not for him. I found something steadying in hearing that, secondhand, from someone who'd known my father for 30 years and had no particular reason to spin the story one way or the other for my benefit. It helped me believe, in the uncertain weeks that followed the party, that what I'd done had actually landed the way I'd hoped it would, not as an attack my father needed to defend himself against, but as information he was, slowly, in his own time, allowing himself to actually sit with. 6 months later. By the following January, 6 months after the party, my parents had made a series of changes that would have been unthinkable to me a year earlier. My father had, with Margaret's help, updated his power of attorney to name me, with my mother as a co-agent and Brian removed entirely. Not as a punishment, my father was careful to say, but because, the last time your brother had access to my finances, neither of us fully understood what that access meant, and I'm not willing to make that mistake twice at my age. They'd refinanced the HELOC into a fixed, lower-interest personal loan with an actual amortization schedule. Something they could see the end of, and my father had gone back, briefly and reluctantly, to part-time consulting work at Ridgeline for 18 months. Not because they were destitute, but because Doug's revised projections showed it would meaningfully extend the life of their remaining retirement savings. And my father, once he'd actually looked at the real numbers instead of the story he'd been telling himself, wanted that security more than he wanted an uninterrupted retirement. Brian and Denise, for their part, sold the Cedar Run house that spring and moved into a smaller rental, a decision I learned about from my mother, who framed it, at first, in the softest possible terms. They decided the house was more than they needed, before eventually admitting, months later, that the real story involved a mortgage they'd genuinely never been able to afford without ongoing help. Help that had finally, after 8 years, stopped coming. I won't pretend that transition was gentle for Brian. It wasn't. There was a period of real financial strain for him and Denise, a period where I know, because my mother told me, they were genuinely frightened about money in a way I don't think either of them had ever had to be before, always having had a safety net stretched invisibly beneath them their entire adult lives. I felt for them in that period, more than I expected to. I also believed, and still believe, that the fear was doing something the money never had. It was forcing an honest reckoning between the two of them about what they could actually afford on their own income, without a family subsidy quietly filling the gap every time reality intruded. I saw my parents more, not less, in that first year after the party, which surprised me, given how it started. My father called every Sunday, a habit he'd never had before, just to talk, sometimes about nothing more than the weather or a Ridgeline colleague's retirement. But the calling itself was new, and I understood it as its own kind of apology. The kind that doesn't use the word but shows up anyway, week after week, until you stop needing it to use the word at all. 3 years later. It's been 3 years now since the night at the Fairview Country Club, and I want to tell you honestly that it isn't a story with a bow on it. My relationship with Brian is better than it was, but it isn't what I once, as a child, imagined a relationship between siblings was supposed to be. It's careful and a little formal, built more on mutual respect for boundaries than on the easy closeness some families seem to manage. My relationship with my mother has more texture to it now than it did before, more honesty, but also more visible friction, because honesty, once you let it into a relationship, tends to bring some friction along with it as the price of admission. My relationship with my father is the one that changed most completely. We talk every week. We've gone fishing together twice, something we never did when I was a kid because fishing, back then, had unofficially belonged to Brian. Financially, my parents are stable. Not wealthy, not the retirement they might have had if none of this had ever happened, but stable, with a clear plan, a realistic budget. And this is the part that matters most to me, full information about where every dollar of what remains actually is and where it's going. My father still thanks me, every so often out of nowhere, for making him look at it, and I've stopped deflecting the thanks the way I used to. I let it land now. I think I've earned that. Maya is 19 now, in her second year at Miami University, studying to be a social worker of all things drawn, she told me once, partly by watching how our family worked through what she called, with the blunt clarity teenagers sometimes have, the whole grandma and grandpa thing. Theo is 15, quieter, more like his father, and asks me sometimes, with real curiosity rather than judgment, why I waited so long to say anything. I don't have a clean answer for him yet. I tell him the truth as best I understand it, that I was raised to believe love and peace were the same thing, and it took me most of my life to learn they aren't. That real peace, the kind that actually holds, sometimes has to be built on the other side of a very uncomfortable truth, and there's no shortcut around that discomfort, only through it. What remained? I think about that folder sometimes. Not the video, not the security guard, not even my mother's face when she said you cannot do this here, but the folder itself, sitting closed in my father's hands for a moment before he finally opened it, days later, alone at his kitchen table, and let himself actually see what was in it. I built that folder because I love this family. In the specific, complicated, unglamorous way you love a family you didn't choose and can't fully leave, even when leaving might have been easier. I built it because somebody had to stand still long enough to add up 40 years of numbers that everyone else had a reason not to add up. And it turned out, in the end, that the person willing to do that math was also the person who'd spent her whole life being told her needs mattered less, because she never seemed to have any. I'm not trying to humiliate anyone, I said that night, standing near the head table in a navy dress with a folder in my hands. I'm trying to make sure 40 years of hard work doesn't quietly disappear because nobody in this family was willing to write anything down. I believe that as completely today as I did the moment I said it. It wasn't revenge. It was accounting, the only language, it turned out, that could finally make a family that had never once agreed on the facts sit still long enough to look at the same page together. If you take one thing from this story, I'd want it to be this: quiet people keep records too. Being the one who never causes problems doesn't mean you don't notice them. Sometimes it just means you're waiting, patiently, for years, sometimes for decades, for the moment when noticing quietly finally has to become saying something out loud. And when that moment comes, you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to have kept the receipts. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you've lived through something like this yourself, in your own family, I hope you'll share it too. These stories help more people than you'd think, more than they usually let on in the comments themselves. If you want to hear the next one, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of your own ledgers too. Sometimes they're the only thing that ends up telling the truth.